I was a 7-year-old boy in 1979. Back then, there wasn't an internet to speak of, and the only electronic gaming system was Pong. I had no siblings, and I lived in a quiet street with few children my age. It was truly a lonely existence, and I was prone to exploring my environment to find any sort of entertainment I could. My father was a traveling insurance salesman and was rarely home. My mother did part-time work at a local business. There were times I would frequently come home alone and have nothing to do. One day I began looking through my father's bookshelf, which had a treasure trove of encyclopedias and specialty books. And that's when I came across one of his Playboys. It was an old school Playboy from the 1960s. It was a flat-spine special issue, and when I pulled it out, I quickly realized that this magazine was different from the other periodicals on the shelf. The women were wearing less clothing. They were all very pretty and had intimate expressions, as if they somehow liked me. I didn't understand intimacy at the time, but some rudimentary element of desire was being fostered, and I was understanding the sexual signaling. When I finally got to the pages of naked women, I sensed an element of embarrassment, but then became fascinated. I would, over the course of time, revisit this book, continually fascinated by the naked women within. It eventually prompted me to keep exploring my house. What else would I find? I'd eventually find my dad's stash of pornography. These magazines were visually different from the Playboy. The women on the cover weren't very glamorous. Rather, they were scantily clad. The words on the cover were more vulgar, usually insinuating some sexual activity or advertising some new model. It was all over the top, and the content side of the covers was shock and awe. The intimate and soft-focused pictures of Playboy were replaced by well-lit nudity and rehashed explicit sex acts. The magazines didn't care about romanticizing the women. Rather, they solely represented the women in a sexual manner. And I looked through every single page, reading the words and discovering the wonders of women posing in every imaginable shape. It was all a new learning experience. I was learning the language of sexual depravity and how the visual experience made me feel excited and alive. It all felt good and compelled me to keep re-engaging. Why stop a good thing? My dad frequently threw out his stash and replenished his supply. He wasn't very discreet when throwing out the magazines, usually just putting them in a thin grocery store plastic bag and setting them out with the trash. He would leave to work, and I would quickly grab them before the garbage men took them away, and thus started my lifelong obsession with hoarding porn. As it turns out, other people dispose of their porn in a similar manner, and I would occasionally find discarded porn magazines roadside and add them to my collection. By the time my teen years came, I was masturbating 6 to 8 times a day to the monster hoard I had amassed. My teenage life in school was typical. In my early teens, I was shy but had what I would describe as a normal sexual curiosity towards the opposite sex. By my late teens, I was having sexual encounters with other teenage girls and having typical relationships. I valued character and wanted to be in healthy relationships, but at times I also valued pure sex and didn't necessarily want the entanglements that relationships produced. Pornography seemed the perfect solution as it allowed me to indulge in sexual pleasure without having to go through the hassle of maintaining a relationship. I still valued having friendships with women, but I wanted sex all the time. Maintaining a full-time relationship was difficult and exhausting, and it didn't always guarantee sex. Finding a full-time sexual relationship was difficult, so I just leaned on pornography use. If sex is what I wanted, sex is what I would have. The internet didn't become a thing in my life until the early 1990s. By that time, I was completing my undergraduate degree. I was a computer enthusiast and using the internet compulsively. Most of my time centered around using online communication through user groups, Usenet was the in technology at the time, where a person could communicate to others through topical groups. Soon I discovered that I could get pirated games and pornography using binary decoding, and my new life as an online pornography user began. Now I no longer needed to rely on magazines. Everything could be virtualized and stored on floppy disks. No nosy moms butting in, no roommates digging through your stuff. Yeah, it answered a lot of problems. And yeah, floppy disks. My dad had hundreds of them and used them for his insurance company as giveaways to help people make insurance decisions. Kind of like how AOL spammed the world with their programs. I would format them and fill them up with porn. Eventually, I moved on to CDs as my hard drive was constantly getting maxed out. Megs became gigs. There never seemed to be enough space. Soon the internet broke wide open and pornography started finding regular hosting sites. At first it was just pictures, then movies came along, and soon the floodgates opened. It was nirvana. Every type of kink and niche was online, ready for whenever I had the whim. I would sometimes have all-night fapathons where self-indulgence never seemed to end. And never once did I ever feel guilty about anything. Why should I feel guilty? It's just sex, right? What harm could there be in self-pleasure? During this time, I was still testing the dating waters, and after a few failed relationships, I finally found the woman I could really relate to. She was a sarcastic ass, just like I was. Our time together always felt special, and for once in my life, sex wasn't that important. I actually liked just being with her. She was my muse, both a great friend and an intimate partner. But I didn't give up on the porn use. Are you kidding me? I liked it. And while I wasn't going to advertise it, she was aware of the fact that I would use it. And no, she didn't seem to mind or care. We would eventually get married and kick off a new phase of our lives. In my late 20s and early 30s, I entered a stage in which my IT career took off. As the pornography on the internet expanded, I did my best to keep up. Sometimes I'd follow specific brands of porn, sometimes models, and sometimes certain sex acts. Only now in my recovery can I look back and say that my consumption patterns had started to change during this time, although back then I was blissfully unaware. When I was getting stressed out at work, I would look forward to porn use as a way of feeling good. When my self-esteem was shot, porn helped the ego take a break. I was frequently self-medicating. Now, you might wonder, you have a wife, why did you still need porn? The simple answer is because immediate gratification is what I wanted. Just like my early dating experiences, sometimes the desire for sex outweighs the demands of maintaining a relationship. And sometimes my wife isn't wanting sex. Sometimes the wife isn't available. And I spent decades understanding that sex can be had any time I wanted. Immediate gratification. And now I could cater that gratification to whatever perverse taste I wanted. If I wanted to have a threesome with twin sisters, I could find it with just a few clicks of the keyboard. What had started out as sexual curiosity gradually grew into indulgence and then became dependency. I wouldn't deal very well with stress, so I masturbated to porn for relief. I couldn't handle depression very well, so I masturbated to porn to feel good about myself. I couldn't see any problems with what I was doing other than the occasional musing about whether the porn industry was creating a culture of commodification. But those arguments with myself always ended with me knowing that I could separate self-pleasure from the larger sociological issues. My porn consumption began taking over larger and larger portions of my life until I spent most of my waking hours outside of work looking at porn. I'd stretch my waking hours doing nothing but searching for porn. And it wasn't just websites. I was using sex forums and using file sharing programs to get the stuff I couldn't find online. I found myself in a pattern of buying beer on the way home from work, and then cracking open that cold one while firing up the computer. And so started my pathway to annihilation, where I would get to sleep at around 3 a.m. just to wake up a few hours later and start the whole cycle again. My mental state gradually began to erode. I fell victim to depressive episodes and panic attacks. I could barely function at work, finding myself constantly in a haze that I couldn't seem to shake. Easy tasks could take days to finish, but still I kept doubling down, using porn as my crutch to get through the next day. Until finally, the worst possible thing that could have happened eventually did. At this phase of my life, I was well into middle age and had a daughter. My career was still going strong, but I struggled to keep up with the rigors of life. Work made constant demands. Fatherhood made constant demands. My continued education made constant demands. I felt like I was always stretched thin. Then, at about 5 a.m. one morning, there was a knock at the door. It was the state police, and they were serving a search warrant. On that particular day, I had fallen asleep in my basement, and my computer was upstairs in my bedroom. I was panicked. In much of my porn surfing behavior, I frequently came across videos of amateur porn where there was an apparent teenage girl, usually doing sex acts on her cell phone. I usually deleted that stuff, but I couldn't remember if I had done it recently. You see, you had to understand the way I was consuming porn. I would literally max out my hard drive before I went ahead and purged. And while I was usually good at deleting the stuff, I couldn't remember if I had done it any time recently. And shit, my wife was about to meet the state police at 5 a.m. This wasn't going to end well. I opened the door and they came in, some with tactical gear on. They found all my electronic devices and my laptop. They immediately started asking me questions and taking pictures of all the rooms in my house. Their forensics team came in and used the basement as their field office. While they held me upstairs, I could hear voices echoing as I had an open floor plan. I could hear the forensic examiner talking to the team lead. They had found something, but I couldn't make out the details. My daughter was dragged from her bedroom crying. She had been asleep, and I'm sure this is all pretty shocking. They asked her if her daddy had ever touched her inappropriately. I wanted to punch that fucking cop. It was pretty evident these officers were going to arrest me irregardless of what I said. They didn't care if I matched a profile or not. All that mattered was that I was in possession of something illegal. As I would find out later on, my file sharing program had indeed been used to download a teenage girl, which the state police had monitored. I did indeed delete that file, and the police could not locate it. However, there were 3 other files on my PC that did have teenage girls performing sex acts. My PC had my name on it, and so it was a slam dunk case. I ended up having to plead guilty on 1 count of possession of child pornography or end up potentially in a worse situation by going to trial. My wife was devastated, but having witnessed several of my anxiety attacks firsthand, she understood my state of mind. She knew I used porn and wasn't threatened by it, but the shock of the arrest deeply upset her. Thankfully, her brother, who was recently recovering alcoholic himself, tied everything that had happened together and recognized that my actions were the result of my obsessive-compulsive behavior. He had me attend a few AA meetings before I ultimately ended up in SLAA. Through therapy and the 12-step program, I opened up to my wife about my mental health and was able to make a turnaround. But that post-arrest time was just brutal. My arrest was published in the news, and I was publicly humiliated. I lost every professional and personal friend I had made in 20 years. I was relieved of all my civic responsibilities. And my young daughter was left wondering why Daddy was taken to jail. I was immediately fired from my job. So let's just recap. I lost my job, lost my friends, and had my reputation dragged through the dirt. People talk about rock bottom. Sometimes it's difficult to imagine how bad things can really be. But in my situation, the reality was overwhelming. I considered suicide several times. But thankfully, my brother-in-law intervened and made it a practice to keep reaching out, keep talking. This would be the beginning of rebuilding my life, one step at a time. Everything I had done to this point was behind me now, and I had to find a new way to carry on. And the new goals wouldn't be about my career or getting ahead. They would be about how I would rebuild myself. I had to learn to manage my depression and anxiety. I had to learn how to manage cravings. I had to learn how to be healthy in both mind and body. It was like getting a degree and taking care of yourself, something that I had to do full time. All this with the auspices of going to jail and possibly being a sex offender. And I'm here to tell you that I'm a million times better off than where I was, thanks in part for the effort and work I've put into it. My whole dedication to this channel is a reflection on the work that it means to me and my desire to share it. I put in the time with yoga and meditation, and I do the 12-step meetings twice a week. I have talks with my sponsor, and I read a shitload of books. I have a lot of knowledge to give, and I don't want other people to suffer like I've suffered. And if you're suffering, I'm here to tell you that there is hope for finding a way out. It's slow, and you're going to have to put in a shitload of effort, but the work will pay off. I'm closer to my family now than I ever was before. I have more open communication with others. I have found meaningfulness in my life, and it keeps depression, anger, and anxiety at bay, which in turn helps keep me from constantly needing to self-medicate. I've learned to short-circuit my cravings and recognize the signs of anger and denial. I ended up pleading guilty to 1 count of possession. I am on a sex offenders list. That might all sound pretty horrible, and I'll be the first person to tell you that it isn't something I'd wish on anybody. I was sentenced to a month in jail, and I had a lot of anger afterwards, dwelling on how a good person gets the shit end of the stick. But here and now, I'm at peace. I've got more peace in my life than I ever have. I've made peace with not having my way. And each day, I look forward to making myself a better person and to help others get out of their porn dependency. There is a light at the end of my tunnel. I have 5 years of probation, and then I'm eligible to get my charge expunged, which allows me to be removed from the sex offenders list. That's 5 years of not being able to see my daughter's recitals at school, soccer games, or swim meets. But it could have been much worse, and I plan on using every second of that time to help fix the damage that decades of excessive porn use have caused. I hope this story helps you. Please subscribe if you find this content useful. This channel is dedicated to helping those with compulsive porn use get out of their habit by providing helpful tactics. I thank you for watching.